This is Dr. Spellman, and I'm going to be giving a lecture here on cultural relativism. So this is the chapter from Shafer Landau's textbook that talks about relativism. All right, to introduce some terminology or I guess a framework, I need to talk about the standard conception of ethics. So the standard conception of ethics is committed to the following three claims. The first claim is that there are moral rules, standards, or truths. The second claim is that the moral rules, standards, or truths are objective. And the third is that these rules, standards, or truths sometimes require individuals to act altruistically. So the idea here is it's not that these claims are things that we're just assuming and that you can't question them. Rather, this is just kind of the standard view amongst philosophers. Some philosophers reject these claims, but most accept them, and they're kind of like a framework that we're generally going to work within. I want to kind of do some work to defend the standard conception of ethics, so that's what we're kind of going to do here. The first claim I'll say, the claim that there are moral rules, standards, or truths, that can be denied. Nihilists deny that claim. We're not going to talk about nihilism here. Claim number two, the moral rules, standards, or truths are objective. That is the claim that the cultural relativist denies, or relativists in general. So relativists admit, number one, that there are moral rules, standards, or truths. They just think that they're relative to a culture, that they're not objective. So we'll talk about what that means in a little bit. All right. Okay, so what do we mean by objective? So ethical objectivism says that some moral rules, standards, or truths apply to everyone, regardless of their culture's ideals or their individual beliefs. The thought here is that there are some rules that are just true and that apply to you no matter what. You sort of can't escape the rule. No matter what culture you live in, no matter what you believe about morality, there are some things that are just true regardless. The thought that it's wrong to murder, for example, might be a pretty plausible candidate for an objective rule. Relativism denies that there are any objective rules. So the relativist says that all moral rules, standards, or truths are relative to cultures or individuals, such that if there were a culture that said that murder is okay, or that murder is okay like in these circumstances or something like that, then as long as you're in that culture and you're obeying the culture's rules, then and they say murder is okay, then it is in fact okay to murder in that situation. There's a distinction between sort of two kinds of relativism. So one relativism says that, well, the moral rules depend on the particular culture's guiding ideals. So this is cultural relativism. It says an agent's action is permissible if and only if their culture's guiding ideals permit it. So here the thought might be that in the United States we have a guiding ideal that sexism is wrong. So if you're engaging in a practice that's sexist, then you're doing something that's wrong. Even if maybe you believe that sexism is okay, that sort of draws a distinction with ethical subjectivism. So ethical subjectivism says that an agent's action is morally permissible if and only if the agent believes that it is morally permissible. So on this view, whether or not an action is permissible depends on what you yourself believe. So it's possible that you and your culture disagree about something, maybe about whether or not, I use the example of sexism. Should I just stick with that one? So if your culture says, hey, sexism is wrong, but you think, no, sexism is right, and you perform an act that's sexist, then ethical subjectivism might say that's okay, whereas cultural relativism would say that it's wrong. On the poll, I asked students whether they thought relativism was compelling, and it was a pretty even split. So a fair number said yes, a fair number said no, and then a slightly smaller number said that they weren't sure about it. To be clear, I think Shafer Landau thinks that relativism is false, and I think that relativism is false. So we're gonna talk about some attractions of relativism and some criticisms of it, but ultimately, I think we are arguing that you should reject relativism, that sort of the standard conception of ethics is right, and that there are deep problems with relativism to explain why, like, no one should accept relativism. All right, so first I want to talk a little bit about the attractions of relativism. What evidence might we have in favor of it? Why might we think that it's plausible in the first place? Shafer Landau talks about, I think, 5 attractions of cultural relativism. So one attraction is this thought that morality or ethics is ultimately like a human phenomenon. And one thing that would explain why that's true is that something like cultural relativism is true. So the truth of cultural relativism would explain why we need humans or society more generally in order to have more rules. Relativism says, right, the rules depend on the culture. And so if you don't have any culture, you don't have any rules. And so maybe it's true that there's no morality without culture. That might be like a point in favor of relativism. Attraction number 2, it provides a scientific account of morality. So relativism allows us to evaluate what the moral rules are without appeals to like any sort of fancy, weird or strange normative facts. So science is a descriptive discipline, not a normative one. So science just tells us the way things are out in the world, not the way that they should be. And you might think, oh, it'd be nice if we could just use science to tell us what morality, what's moral or not. And if cultural relativism is true, then science can tell you what's moral, because we can just look at what people think about murder and we find like people are against murder. And so it turns out that murder's wrong. Relativism, if we embrace that, would allow us to like use science to get answers about what's moral. Closely connected is this idea that if we're cultural relativists, we can explain how we have knowledge of morality. Because it's scientific on cultural relativism, we can just use science, and we know a lot of things through science. If we can use science to figure out facts about morality, then presumably we can have knowledge of that as well. Some people worry that, like, is abortion morally permissible or not? Some people think, oh, I don't know. And in fact, it's impossible to know whether or not abortion is moral. But if cultural relativism was true, we could sort of figure it out just by looking at figuring out what our social norms were. Now, there might be cases in which what the norms are in your culture are unclear. So maybe abortion, even for the relativists, would be a case where it was unclear what was morally right or wrong, but not because we didn't know how to figure it out, rather because just what our society's guiding ideals are was unclear. Okay. 4, cultural relativism entails that we shouldn't judge one's cultural moral code as being superior to another culture's moral code or codes. So here the thought is that cultural relativism supports a kind of tolerance. So other people sort of go about their lives certain ways, we go about our lives other ways, and we shouldn't judge our own culture to be superior to those other ones. Like, yes, in the United States, we oppose eating dogs and cats, but in some Asian countries, they're okay with eating dogs and cats. And we shouldn't think that like we're the best and that those other societies are backwards and wrong. Like, hey, it is true that it's wrong to eat dogs and cats in the United States, but it's not wrong to eat dogs and cats in those other cultures where they're perfectly fine with it. Cultural relativism kind of explains why we shouldn't judge other cultures. And then the last attraction, I think, again, this is sort of connected with 4 in a certain way. This kind of like idea that cultural relativism seems to support tolerance. Like, we shouldn't impose our moral beliefs on other cultures. And so we should be open to their beliefs about morality being right. And I guess in some sense, the idea is like, well, when in Rome, like, when you're in Rome, you can do what the Romans do. When you're not, when you're in America, you should do what the Americans do. And we should just accept our differences, not like start wars or fights or things like that with cultures that are different than our own. They're just doing their own thing. To give like some quick examples of, or maybe like a different way of thinking about the attraction of relativism, we've got a couple examples, and these come from a chapter by James Rachels. So one is an example of cannibalism. So in ancient Greece, there was this famous book. I forget what book this comes from, but they use this example where, like, there are these Colossians who are eating the dead, and the Greeks are burning the dead, and there's like some disagreement about what's the right thing to do here: eat the dead or burn the dead. And when we look at that debate, we might, I don't know, I'm not sure exactly what your reaction will be. You might think eating the dead, ugh, that's weird. You know, that's wrong. But maybe when you step back and think about it for a second, you're sort of like, well, they were just doing the thing that people in their culture did. And although would seem weird to us, maybe it's okay for them to do it. So um, you might think something like this, like, it seems like if you're Galatian, then eating the dead is the right thing to do, or at least it's an okay thing to do. Some might think it'd be wrong not to, right? So you should eat the dead if everybody else in your culture is doing it. It might be like disrespectful not to. So we can sort of understand and think it's at least okay for the Galatians to eat the dead. But then if we think about like, well, what if you're Greek and they burn the dead? Would it be okay to eat the dead if you're in Greece? No, it doesn't seem like it. Or if you think about contemporary America, would it be okay for us to eat the dead? No, it does not seem okay for us to eat the dead. It seems like it'd be wrong. So the idea here is just there are different cultures doing different things, and what the right thing to do in some sense depends on what culture you're in. You should do the thing that your culture does. Another example is the example of infanticide. So the Inuits had this practice of infanticide, while some like us, contemporary America, we don't. Now, when you look at the Inuits practicing infanticide, and this is like something that's not done, like they're not killing every child, obviously the society wouldn't uh, continue to exist, but they're doing it sort of from time to time, maybe when resources are short. And when we look at them, we think, is that okay or not? It's very different than us. We might be inclined to think that there's something wrong, but there might be another part of us, right, that sort of understands, or that says, hey, they're in sort of this different context. Their culture said it was okay. Who are we to judge, right? I think that's the cultural relativist motivation. Like when we're looking at the Inuit people, we're sort of thinking like, would it be okay for them to practice infanticide? You think like, well, maybe, okay, sure, that's okay. But if you're an American, no, you can't do it. It's not okay. What relativism is doing here is it's explaining how actions like eating the dead, burning the dead, or infanticide can be acceptable in one culture but immoral in another. So depending on where you're at, what your culture says is right, that affects what the morality of the action is. That's the attraction of the view. It can sort of explain this in a way that objectivism seems like it's not able to. Like if we were objectivists, we might think, well, eating the dead either has to always be wrong or it has to always be right, or infanticide has to always be wrong or it has to always be right. But relativism sort of allows us to say, no, in some cases, okay, in other cases, it's not. Okay, so we've been over the attractions of relativism. Now we might wonder if there are any problems with it or what evidence we have against it. Regarding problems for relativism. So one problem for relativism is that it doesn't actually support tolerance all the time. it only supports tolerance in societies that are tolerant. So imagine you're in a society that says, do not tolerate opposing views, burn those people at the stake. Well, in that society, if people have opposing views to the culture, then we burn those people to the stake. That, in fact, would be the right thing to do. So tolerance, according to cultural relativism, tolerance is only the right approach if your society itself is tolerant. If your society is intolerant, then cultural relativism says that you're obligated to be intolerant. So maybe this one attraction, or this thing we thought was an attraction, isn't really an attraction after all. Cultural relativism seems to be maybe like less tolerant than a kind of objectivism, or an objective view that says tolerance is generally a good thing. Okay, problem number 2, relativism implies that each culture or each individual's, that's like a subjective view, that each culture's code is morally infallible. The thought here is like, well, think back to the, think back to the antebellum South, where Americans, at least in the South, are engaged in slavery. And the thought is that if cultural relativism is true and our culture's guiding ideals say that slavery is allowed, then slavery is allowed. It's perfectly fine. That seems like a problem. We could look at other places like Nazi Germany. If Nazi Germany says that, committing genocide is the right thing to do, then committing genocide is the right thing to do. Or if oppressing women in a particular society is like the right thing to do, if the ideals suggest that, then it is in fact the right thing to do. That seems like a real problem. Relativism also implies that moral reformers are always mistaken. So, like, insofar as Martin Luther King Jr. was combating the general view that racism is wrong, then Martin Luther King Jr. was mistaken. He was morally flawed. Like, he was doing something that was immoral insofar as he was trying to change the moral norms. But that would be weird. For relativism implies that moral progress is impossible. Like, a culture's moral views can change, but they can never get better. So on this view, when the United States abolished slavery, we didn't become better morally, we just became different morally. So remember, the relativist says, like, hey, every culture's moral views are equal in some sense. We should respect them and do whatever they say, that there couldn't really be like some country that had better moral views than some other one. But I think that when we abolished slavery, we did become better. I think when we gave women the right to vote, we did become a better society. And so if that's right, then cultural relativism has got to be mistaken. Finally, cultural relativism can't really account for the existence of cross-cultural or interpersonal moral disagreement. The thought here is that sometimes it seems like we disagree with people about whether or not a certain practice is permissible. In the past, you had like Chinese foot binding. So this cultural practice in China, where they would bind women's feet to make them really small and grow less, which causes a lot of pain for women as they grow older. Their bone structures in their feet are just like not meant to hold their bodies at that point. And so it's hard for them to walk and quite painful. Now, that was a cultural practice that they said was okay. And we might say, like, hey, Chinese foot binding is wrong. Like, you shouldn't be doing this. And they said, no, it's fine for us to do it. Now, if relativism were true, it would kind of make no sense to have this disagreement. Like, what are we doing trying to argue with them? Like, of course, it's fine in their society to do it. Of course, in our society, it's not fine to do it. What are we arguing about here? The fact that we're arguing suggests that we think there is some objective morality. We think that cultures can be wrong about things and that they should change their views. All right. Maybe I haven't put this clearly enough, but I think those objections or problems with relativism are real problems, like inescapable problems. Even if there's something attractive about relativism, those flaws are like huge flaws in a moral theory. So yeah, too many flaws, too many problems, that view can't be right. So the thought then is like, well, how could we explain the attractions of moral relativism without having to like buy into moral relativism? If relativism is false, how could what we saw earlier seem to be true? Like it seemed like an action was right in one culture, like eating the dead maybe, but then wrong in another. So how's that possible if relativism is false? I think that like if we want objectivism to be true, we need to be able to explain what's going on here, and I think we can. So I'll say a few things, right? When you move from one society to another, several things change. So people's factual beliefs change. That's one thing that changes. Their religious beliefs change. Their values change. And the physical environment that they're living in changes. So all these things are different from one society to another. Now, of course, some societies are similar in their physical environments, or maybe they're similar in their religious beliefs, but some of these other things probably are changing. I don't know, I'm trying to think about good examples here about factual beliefs changing. Presumably, like some societies think that like harsh punishments are a good deterrent, whereas other societies don't think that that's true. Or some societies might think be more on board with climate change than other societies. Those are differences in factual beliefs. Obviously, some countries have different religious beliefs than others. That's related to their values oftentimes. So people who have different religious beliefs often have different values, but you could have people with the same religious beliefs in many ways, or that, different countries where Christianity dominates, but that have sort of different values. In America, maybe we value liberty and freedom more than some other Christian countries do. In those countries, maybe they value equality more. And then obviously the physical environment. Some places are hot, other places are cold, other places are more temperate, whatever. Things change. So the thought here is like, say all that's true. It could be that these contextual changes are the things that change the morality of an action. So rather than like morality being different from one place to the next, it's really like morality depends on the circumstances or the context. And when we've changed from one culture to another, we've changed the values, we've changed the religious beliefs. It's those things that are changing the morality or moral status of an action. So let's look at like one of the examples. The Colossians, right? They wanted to be eaten when they died. So in that case, eating the dead was probably the best way to respect them. If you're in Galatia and someone dies, like the way you respect the dead is by eating them. But we are different, right? We have different beliefs, we have different values. We don't want to be eaten when we die. So in our society, eating the dead wouldn't be a good way of respecting us when we die. That would be quite insulting to eat somebody's dead body, right? Okay, so what this suggests is that even if we disagree with the Galatians about how exactly we should treat the dead, we might nevertheless have some agreement on the point that the dead ought to be respected. So there's some disagreement at a certain level, but then there's widespread agreement at another level. We might be able to say something similar with the Inuits, right? The Inuits didn't want to kill infants necessarily. At least there's no reason to think that they were like blood-loving, like murderers. They didn't want to kill the infants, but they had limited access to food, limited access to effective birth control, so it might have been necessary for them to sacrifice some infants to preserve others, given the harsh conditions that they were living in. But in our society, both of those things are relatively widely available. Food is widely available, effective birth control is widely available, so we don't need to sacrifice any infants to preserve other children. In this case, what's going on is it's not a difference in like some value or way to respect people or something like that. That Inuits didn't think that like, oh, we're respecting the kids by killing them. Instead, it seems to be a difference in the physical environment that changed the morality of infanticide. So in one case, right, widely available food, in another case, not so much. One case, widely available birth control, in another place, not so much. And that might change the morality of infanticide from one culture to the next. Okay, some conclusions. Relativists are right that they, insofar as they want a theory where cultural differences affect the morality of actions, but insofar as their view entails that cultures or individuals are infallible, that is going way too far. They should not say that. It's not just that they shouldn't say it, that, I guess I should say, insofar as cultural relativism entails that, we need to reject cultural relativism. Cultural difference can affect the morality of actions, but societies are not infallible. Instead, we need to accept something like ethical objectivism while acknowledging that the morality of an action can be influenced by circumstantial factors where the culture's guiding ideals or individual agent beliefs are a factor that can influence the morality of someone's action. So we should accept that, like, killing babies is bad, but acknowledge that if in certain circumstantial factors, it might become okay given the other values at stake. All right. If you want to, you could stop the video at this point. I'm just going to talk briefly about a couple cases that are related to questions of cultural relativism. So if you want to continue and learn a little bit more, you can. If not, you've got the main stuff you need to know already. Okay. In this first case, they talk about the Aztecs. The Aztecs dominated what is now central Mexico from the 1300s through the early 1500s. They believed that the gods required human sacrifice, and their religion held that if they did not provide human sacrifices, the gods would destroy the world and all humanity. So the mythology said gods had done this before, recreating the world each time. So to satisfy the gods' commands, the Aztecs are thought to have sacrificed thousands of people each year, including prisoners and slaves. What do you think? Was it permissible for the Aztecs to do this? You might be torn, right? On the one hand, you think, well, that's horrible. You shouldn't commit human sacrifice. On the other hand, you're like, who are we to judge? We didn't live in their society. So what do we want to say about this action? I think to sort of discuss a case like this, we can draw a distinction between moral rightness and moral praiseworthiness. So on the one hand, there's rightness and wrongness. And when we use those terms, we're evaluating actions. On the other hand, there's praiseworthiness and blameworthiness, and those are ways in which we evaluate people or agents. Okay, so we've got this distinction between rightness and wrongness on the one hand, praiseworthiness and blameworthiness on the other hand. And it's worth noting that rightness and praiseworthiness normally go together. So when we save a drowning child, right, we think that's the right thing to do and it's praiseworthy. Rightness, praiseworthiness go hand in hand. Similarly, wrongness and blameworthiness usually go together as well. So if we steal someone's television, generally we think that's wrong and it's blameworthy. Bad action, bad person. However, it's important to note that these two concepts, rightness on the one hand, praiseworthiness on the other, can come apart. So if you do a good action for a bad reason, that could be the morally right thing to do, but it's not really a praiseworthy thing to do. Shoot, I'm having a hard time coming up with something off the top of my head. Good action for a bad reason. Maybe you should try and think of one, come up with one for yourself here. I'm trying to think, like, maybe you give someone something that they want because you think although they want it, it's actually bad for them. So someone, you see like a glass of water that someone has, I don't know, put something gross in, like an old sock. I don't know. And they're like, oh man, I'm so thirsty for water. Can I have a drink of that? And, oh wait, is this a good action for a bad reason? I don't know if this is going to work. Anyway, you give them the thing that they want, the sort of glass of water, but like knowing that it has a sock in it, you think, oh, this is cool, or it had a sock in it, like this is cool because like little do they know they had this nasty sock in there. Here we might think the morality of your action is sort of like, in a way, it's like unclear because you're doing the thing that they wanted you to do, and insofar as like you're helping them out, you're giving them what they want, that seems like the right thing to do. On the other hand, your motivations or reasons are kind of bad, and so maybe you're kind of blameworthy for doing this. That's not the greatest example ever, but it's one kind of case that can show that like maybe the rightness and praiseworthiness of an action can come apart. Alternatively, you could do a bad action for a good reason. That can be praiseworthy without being morally right. So maybe you think that you're, I don't know, again, not a great example. I should think more about these. Your brother seems to be injured, and you're like, oh, the way to fix his injury is to punch him really hard in his shoulder. Maybe his shoulder has been dislocated, and you have the false belief that punching a dislocated shoulder will help pop it back into place. No problem, that this is easy to do. So he dislocates his shoulder, and you punch him. It causes him more extreme pain. It's like way worse. He's like, ow, why did you do that? How dare you? Or something like that. But you thought all along, right, that this was going to be helpful. So we might think like, okay, like this motivation, or at least part of your action was praiseworthy. You had the right intentions, but the action itself was like not the right one. It was a wrong one to do. That's a case where you could do a bad action for a good reason. And that may be praiseworthy, but we wouldn't say like you did the right thing. Wrongness and blameworthiness, it seems like, can come apart in the same ways. So just as rightness and praiseworthiness don't always go together, wrongness and blameworthiness don't always go together. So if we're thinking about the Aztecs case, right, the act of human sacrifice seems morally wrong. You should not be sacrificing humans to the gods. Like, that is not a good thing to do. I think we're in agreement there. But the Aztecs did it for an apparently good reason, right? They thought that if they didn't do it, the world would be destroyed and all of humanity would go extinct. So they had a pretty good reason. Like, if you don't do something, then all of humanity is going to be destroyed. Yeah, in that case, you should probably do it. So, well, I would say that their action was wrong. Like, they actually shouldn't have done that thing. It was a bad thing to do. I wouldn't say that their action was blameworthy. So it's understandable, right? We might excuse them. That's the sort of thing we might say. So that's a sort of case where, right, relativism looked like it could help us explain why, like, it's wrong for us to practice human sacrifice, but maybe okay for them. Rather, what we maybe should say is like, it's wrong to perform human sacrifice now and then. It's always wrong. Objectively true. Don't sacrifice. Objectively true. You should not sacrifice humans. But maybe it would be blameworthy for us now. We have no reason to think that that would be a good idea, but blameless for them then, because they did have sort of these cultural ideas, views, factual beliefs that were mistaken and led them to think that that was a good thing. Okay, one last case. There's this case in 1972 of a flight that crashes in a remote location in the mountains. There are 45 people on board, including 19 members of a rugby team, some of their family, friends, and supporters. After the crash, 28 people survived, but they were starving. There wasn't enough food around for them to eat. So the survivors found the ones, right, that had died and ate their bodies, sustaining themselves on the flesh of the dead until they were finally rescued. What do we think? Was it permissible for these passengers to eat the flesh of the dead? Should we be relativists, right? Like, I don't know, about cannibalism, like sometimes it's okay and sometimes it's not. I think we can say that it's sometimes okay to eat people and sometimes not. And maybe you're like, Dr. Spellman, what are you saying? Okay, so maybe this is a hot take, but it can be okay to do something sometimes and not okay to do it other times. not merely because of the context, but because of the circumstantial features that are involved. So in general, right, food widely available. In this case, food is not widely available, and people are going to die if they don't eat these other humans. So in this case, what I'm inclined to say is that, like, was it okay for them to eat the dead? Yeah, it was okay. Not because objectivism is false. It's just that, like, and it's not because relativism is true, right? There's nothing like about cultural relativism that's going on here. What's changing is just the circumstances. So objectively, we might think if there's plenty of food around, wrong to eat humans. But if there's not enough food around, then eating humans is okay, like the dead ones. So in this case, right, there's this act of cannibalism that, their circumstances are changing, and maybe that changes the morality of action. All right, that's all I have in this lesson. Hopefully you've learned something about cultural relativism. As I've argued, right, we should reject cultural relativism, but embracing objectivism, but acknowledging that the circumstantial factors that are going on in the situation can affect the morality of an action. All right, that's it. Have a good one.